You're listening to the Better for America podcast, presented by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your AMAC podcast, Better for America. And today we have with us a leading voice in American security policy, a tried and true friend of AMAC, a distinguished former government leader, and now an iconic figure in the world of conservative thought, and that is Fink Gaffney. Mr. Fink Gaffney is not just knowledgeable and seasoned in his views, but Fink Gaffney is someone with the American dream in his nature, someone who went from being a former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration to a vocal analyst, a writer, and speaker, to founding the Center for Security Policy, and now hosting both television and radio shows as the host of Secure Freedom Radio. We are just so honored to have a leading voice on national security and a defender of America, a great friend to us, Mr. Fink Gaffney. Welcome to the show, Frank. Great to have you here.
Rebecca, that is a marvelous introduction. I'd like to cast it in stone if I can. Would you mind?
Oh,
it's perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Frank, I'm so pleased to have you here. One of the reasons why we do this show is our over 2.4 million AMAC members and Americans really out there that are listening today, all Americans of all ages, are concerned about where our country is headed. And I want to talk for a moment about China before we talk about some of the issues and threats right here in the US. I want to talk about China. I want to talk about the threat that they face. And really, I want to point to something, Frank, you and I discussed this earlier, and we were talking about, here we have China. We see what's going over there, genocide, like unbelievable. I think people listening need to understand a little bit more what's really happening over there. And don't we, as US America, don't we have a moral obligation to put a spotlight on what's going on over there in China? And also, what about our athletes? Can you talk to me a little bit about the Chinese Communist Party and really what they're doing? Their submission of human rights and US interests, and they're really profiting. Speak to that if you could.
Well, there's a number of different themes there. Let me sort of address the most important one, though, and that is thank you for what you're doing at AMAC. I have a chance to interact with Robert Charles and you all with some regularity, and I just appreciate enormously what AMAC does for our country, and the chance to participate in informing this massive, membership that you have is one of my highest honors. So thank you for giving me the chance to do so, especially to talk about the Chinese Communist Party, because I think the people who make up the AMAC audience almost certainly appreciate better than most Americans. This is the most dangerous adversary our nation has ever faced, bar none. And that is because it has the combination of a very, very considerable amount of power growing by the day, in fact, in part thanks to us, which is a topic I hope we can return to. But it also has global ambitions that it makes no secret of. Under Xi Jinping, the dictator of communist China, there is a concerted effort underway to achieve global domination. And the only real impediment to the CCP, as it's called, doing that is us. So it is pursuing systematically, relentlessly, through a technique they call unrestricted warfare, a people's war against the United States. And interestingly enough, most Americans have no idea of this. Back in May of 2019, they actually declared that war on the pages of one of the Chinese Communist Party's most important propaganda outlets, People's Daily. Which brings me to the fundamental part of the question you asked, which is the Chinese wish us harm, make no mistake about it. But they're also doing incalculable harm to their own people. And my point is, any country that oppresses and tortures and rapes and actually murders in very large numbers its own population is not to be trusted when it comes to treating ours well. And that's especially so when, as I say, their stated objective is our elimination, to the point where literally they have actually got as their purpose with an illegal biological weapons program, depopulating the United States so that it can be colonized by the Chinese Communist Party. So when you see genocide taking place in Western China now, a region historically known as East Turkestan, that the Chinese call Xinjiang, what you're seeing is really just a taste of what they have in the mind for anybody else who stands in their way, including us. And again, this brings us to the Genocide Games, as we call them. These Olympic Games, scheduled for next month in Beijing, are going to be a public relations, a propaganda windfall for the Chinese Communist Party, unlike anything we've seen in the history of Olympic Games going back to 1936, when Adolf Hitler used the Summer Games in Berlin of that year to showcase his regime and to demonstrate that the world, the so-called international community, was good with the Third Reich and his ambitions. And he made no secret at that point that he sought to punish. I don't think it was quite clear that he intended to eliminate, but certainly he was going to treat very badly the Jews, and that his ambitions for dominating first Europe and then, if he could, the rest of the world was not a secret either. So we're seeing sort of a reprise of what happened in 1936, Rebecca, in Beijing in our time. And that is that you will, I'm afraid, if we go, if we participate, if our athletes are there, it will be deemed by the Chinese Communist Party, our mortal enemy, not only as a vindication of their belief that they could murder Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities en masse with impunity. And two things will flow from it, just as we saw in Germany in the mid-1930s. One, more genocide at home and more aggression abroad. And neither of those are things that we should want any part of, let alone be actually encouraging.
Yeah, and thank goodness we've got one courageous NBA player who is denouncing this preoccupation with making money and promoting CCP propaganda. And we heard Freedom has asked the Warriors owner whether he'd care if female members of his own family were being tortured or gang raped every day, like the Uyghur woman. We really, this is such a serious, real issue, and we should all be outraged and we should all care. And let's just pray that our American Olympians are safe. They should care about this genocide and anybody who is submitting.
Well, they actually shouldn't go. I mean, and there's another reason why they shouldn't go. As you know, Rebecca, the Chinese Communist Party has in the past couple of weeks been systematically and comprehensively, in the most unimaginably repressive way possible, been locking down city after city after city across the country because they've got some kind of public health crisis. Now, they lie about all of this, so it's not quite clear what's going on, whether it's just a case of Omicron turning up there, or it's some new, much more lethal strain than Omicron, or whether, as some reports have indicated, it's hemorrhagic fever. Whatever it is, they have, at last count, I heard 65 million people in China locked down, some of them with their, apartment building gates welded shut so they couldn't get out. And what you're seeing is, I think, a situation which, under any other circumstance, if it weren't for the bullying of the Chinese Communist Party, the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, the sponsors of these games would be saying, as was done in in Japan 2 years ago, we're going to postpone this. Or maybe we're going to change the venue altogether. We're just not going to go to China, which is really what they should be doing. But
that's right.
The health of our athletes is on the line, not just our moral standing, not just what we're going to do to embolden our mortal enemy. And here's the piece of it about the genocide, if I could just quickly. It's not just, how we as individuals feel about this kind of barbaric behavior. And you alluded to, gang rapes of women, for example, which is the lot in life of Uyghur Muslim women who are in these concentration camps in China. Among other things, the torture, the forced organ harvesting, the murder outright and the like, the persecution of Christians on an unimaginably large scale. All of that is going on. At the same time, the Chinese are mounting these threats to us, but we have a treaty obligation under the the Genocide Convention to punish people engaged in genocide. So it's not just how, we should respond morally to this, crimes against humanity on, again, an epic scale. It's that we are duty bound. We are legally obliged to be punishing this behavior, not rewarding it.
Yeah, they are so oppressive of individual liberties. And I do want to mention, let's turn to BlackRock. For those of you listening, BlackRock is an American multinational investment management corporation. BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager. Okay, so we understand that. Now listen to this. BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink, he has become a trusted partner with China's communist leadership. BlackRock is funneling billions of US capital to China. And we know that that carries extreme risk and threatens really America. And isn't there a fiduciary responsibility owed to US pension holders and retirees here in the US? Tell me your thoughts on BlackRock, BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, and why has he partnered with China, and why has he essentially chose China over America? Speak to that. This is important.
These are so vitally important questions. And again, thank you for coming back to it, because as I said earlier, we're enabling the mortal peril that we are seeing posed to us by the Chinese Communist Party, and that they have in mind, in the not too distant future. I'm afraid even of a kinetic kind of physical, violent conflict. BlackRock, just to calibrate on it, is a by some estimates, at least the last I heard, $10 trillion under management investment firm, the largest in the world. It is presided over by a fellow by the name of Larry Fink, its chief executive officer. Larry Fink has made, I believe, billions of dollars doing business with China. And what is so alarming about this, Rebecca, is that it's our money. And especially speaking to, a population of retirees, it's your money that Larry Fink and people like him at Vanguard and other big companies, State Street and the like, they're putting that money into Chinese companies, which, if everything else were on the up and up, would be bad enough. But the trouble is that thanks to a memorandum of understanding that then Vice President Joe Biden helped negotiate back in May of 2013, the Chinese have access to our money, to our stock and bonds markets, on a preferential basis. Unlike American companies, excuse me, who have, pursuant to US laws and regulations, responsibilities to US investors to disclose their fiduciary standing. Are they a good risk? Are you going to be losing your shirt if you invest your money in their company? The Chinese don't have to do that. We can have Chinese companies that are like Luckin Coffee, frauds brought into our capital markets. Or we can have companies like Didi, a ride-sharing company that comes into our markets and pulls in billions of dollars in an initial public offering only within a couple of days, to have the government of China basically define them as in fiduciary or other trouble with the government. And suddenly the market value of those stocks is a fraction of what it was. All of that sort of thing can happen. And Larry Fink doesn't seem to care, because as long as Larry gets his commissions, which are very considerable on these transactions, he is evidently indifferent to the fact that you may lose your shirt with investments in his company that he puts into China. And to give you a sense of just how egregious this is, a terrific outfit, I'm sure well known to many of your listeners, Rebecca, called Consumers Research, has been doing a lot of research into Larry Fink and BlackRock. And it has not only issued a warning against doing business with these guys because of what they're doing in China specifically, they have also written the governors of 10 states that have the largest portfolios being managed of their public pension funds, typically, by BlackRock, saying, get out of there, don't do it. And just, I believe today or yesterday, the state treasurer of West Virginia, a fellow by the name of Riley Moore, decided he was going to take his public pension fund out of BlackRock's management. And I hope this is the beginning of a massive movement across this country by both public pension fund managers as well as those, in mutual funds and index funds and exchange traded funds and others who realize that it is a mistake of the first order to be investing in China, even if it's just because you might, again, lose the value of your investment. But when you add on top of it that money is being used by the Chinese Communist Party to do the sorts of things we've just been talking about, the genocide at home and the building up of this unrestricted warfare threat against us. It's
against us.
Madness.
It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. It really is. We're urging every elected representative, do your due diligence. Thank you so much for helping us get this out. People need to understand this. The CCP, their government is just so oppressive of individual liberties and really dedicated to pursuing global dominance economically, military, philosophically. It is a communist nation. It's much like the former Soviet Union, and they are the anti-America. Without the legitimacy that comes with a representative government, they seem intent on spreading the communist message everywhere as fast and almost as fast and effectively as we've seen the spread of the coronavirus. And in some ways,
brought to you by the same people.
That's right. Unfortunately, yes, that is the sad truth. And I think we touched on this before, Frank, but in some ways, perhaps we have allowed them to get into this position. And so we have to recognize that China is such a threat to our values, perhaps even a greater threat than the Soviet Union was. How do you see?
Could I just say something about that? Because
sure thing.
You brought that up twice, and it's apt. Only this is the evil empire, as my old boss Ronald Reagan called it, on steroids. So the evil empire 2.0, with Chinese characteristics, as they like to say, is a vastly more serious threat than the Soviet Union ever was. Yes, the Soviets had large numbers of nuclear weapons pointed at us. So do the Chinese communists now. But this regime in Beijing has done something that the Soviets could only have dreamt of and never accomplished, which is this deep penetration of the entire world through this so-called practice of engagement. Right. And you have here in this country, most especially, but in Europe, now in Africa, in Latin America, all over Asia, a presence of the Chinese communists in the form of something they call the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially a colonial infrastructure build-out operation financed by payday loans, which when they inevitably cannot be satisfied, the payments, they foreclose on the stuff that they've built, ports, airfields, rail networks, roadways, what have you. And that puts the Chinese in a position to have, as I say, this imperial reach that is truly global. And then on top of it, you have, the extent to which they exercise influence inside, for example, our academic institutions through the Confucius Institute type of operations. And that goes, by the way, not just into our higher learning, that's down to grade level, where
those are the elements
indoctrinating our kids now in the media, in Wall Street, in the business sector more generally, in Washington and the political sphere, and at state levels as well. This is a totally different threat than anything we faced before, because they can at will use supply chains or use their friends, as they call them, their old friends, their influence operations, their subversion, their espionage, their tech theft, all of it against us in the form of unrestricted warfare. And now, thanks in part to Larry Fink and his friends, they've built out a massive military capability as well that is going to be capable of taking ours on, some say already can, decisively in not just the South China Sea and other far reaches of the world away from here, but also, here at home, I'm afraid. And that's right. A totally different deal than we faced from the Soviets in their heyday.
Yeah, this is, my father, Dan Weber, who formed AMAC in 2007, he sounded the alarm back then. He said, we're seeing things happen. We've got to have our eyes focused on China. And we've got so much good content on our website, amac.us. Go ahead and check out our website. We've got more articles that we'll be posting. But folks have got to be aware that we're seeing these elements of this communist ideology all tied back to China. And it really is making a great appearance here in the United States. It's infiltrating our corporate and educational, our political systems right here in America. Yes. And Frank, thank you really for sharing your assessment, because it is just so important. I do want to shift slightly, but I do want to stay on international threats for a moment. Obviously, now we talked about the Soviet Union is gone, and that's thanks to you and your old boss and people like you who work so hard to end Soviet communism. But let me ask you about Russia. First, explain to us how Russia is a real threat to our allies in Europe, to NATO, and are they likely to infiltrate and dominate Ukraine, possibly creating added problems in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland? Because, we do remember, Frank, back in the dark days of the Cold War, when Ronald Reagan, he was convinced that the West could meet that challenge. And I think that Joe Biden, if he wants to defeat Putin's current attempts to humiliate America, really is what he's doing, and our allies, then Biden must, just as President Reagan did, he's got to publicly state that the United States is committed to values of liberty and God and dignity of the human person. But we don't hear that coming from Joe Biden. So why would Joe Biden allow Europe to be so dependent on Russia for oil, but at the same time take America from energy independence to now we're no longer energy independent? Why would they allow that to happen? And are we seeing the rise of a more aggressive Russia in the future?
Well, again, a multi-part question requires a multi-part answer. Let me just say about Joe Biden, honestly, Joe Biden is no Ronald Reagan, that's for sure, or even a Donald Trump. I think what we're dealing with is a man who, on his best days, was neither a particularly thoughtful leader, especially when it comes to the various threats we face, In fact, he, has been deeply compromised by the one we were just discussing, the Chinese Communist Party, and arguably the Russians as well, through financial transactions with his family members, most especially. But beyond that, he's not in his best form, needless to say. And I think the cumulative effect of all of that and the determination of the people around him to fundamentally transform America, as Barack Obama used to say, in I think truly a Marxist sense of those words, means that we now have a full-on wrecking operation taking place. Domestically, and we can talk about that if there's time, but internationally, it's particularly evident. Look no further than Afghanistan, of course, as a complete, unmitigated disaster brought to us by Joe Biden. And you can bet that those Chinese communist enemies that I talked about at length earlier, and the Russian ones, have taken stock of the weakness, the irresolution, the compromise of Joe Biden and are seeking to exploit it. Which brings me to the threat from Russia. Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia for 2 decades or so now, has made absolutely clear repeatedly that he considers the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And as you may have noticed, there were a lot of contenders for that distinction. World War I, World War II, and the Cold War and on. He considered it to be the fall of the Soviet Union. And I believe that though his economy is much diminished, his country as well, it's no Soviet empire any longer, but his aspiration has been to get even. If he can't build back to the old Soviet empire or even a Russian empire, he certainly wants to punish those in Europe, and most especially the United States, NATO, if you will, for what it did to humiliate the Russian people, as he sees it, and to reestablish the greatness of the Kremlin and its rule. And that gives rise to a danger, yes, to Ukraine. We've already seen that country invaded by Putin, to other nations, Georgia, for example, to Russia's south, and to Russia's west. The Baltic states, you mentioned 2 of them, Estonia is another one, and further east as well. And what's making this even more problematic is, as I think you indicated, Joe Biden said to Vladimir Putin, in a seemingly one-sided concession, that he was going to remove the objections that Donald Trump had interposed to having a Russian pipeline that would feed natural gas from Russia around Ukraine to Germany, meaning that the Russians would be able directly to control the energy security of our allies in Western Europe. And that has given rise, I think, to an even greater likelihood that Putin will try to exploit the opportunities of a weak America, Europe that's dependent upon him, and the lack of really any concerted opposition. Plus, another piece that's a very important strategic factor here, an increasing strategic partnership with Communist China to his advantage in building back, to reinstating something akin to the former glory of the Soviet Union. And that's what makes this so problematic in Ukraine, plus I think quite possibly elsewhere. And for us, what we're facing, I fear, and I hope I'm wrong about this, Rebecca, please God, let me be wrong about this, but I think that what's in the offing here, perhaps as early as March, once these genocide games are over in China, is the Chinese will go at it in Taiwan or perhaps India or maybe other parts of South China to envelop Taiwan, the South China Sea, that is. Or perhaps Russia will go for it in Ukraine or maybe the Baltic states or possibly Eastern Europe. Iran, which we haven't gotten to yet, but is also a candidate for serious problems, may go at it with Israel, or Israel may feel obliged to preempt the nuclear Iran that's now in the offing. Any one of these things, to say nothing of North Korea, Pakistan, we look to see, I think, conflict breaking out, and quite possibly on an unimaginable scale, global scale, for the reasons that I've mentioned before, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's global ambitions. And whether, it's the Chinese that start this, the Russians, the Iranians, I think all of them will pile on once it happens, quite possibly giving rise truly to a, new world war in our time, on our watch.
Well, I do pray that you are wrong there, Frank, but it does bring me to another big question that I have for you. And thank you. You are you're truly one of the living experts in many of these areas, and you have spent a lot of time studying and writing and talking about the specter of global terrorism. So if you could try to help us look accurately at the radical Islamic nation of Iran and the threat that nation poses. Is it true that they could attain a nuclear weapon in the near future? And what would that mean? And then if that is a real threat, how do we address that threat?
The Iranian regime came to power in 1979 thanks to Jimmy Carter's, malfeasance, I think, and has ever since stated explicitly, publicly, relentlessly, that it seeks to bring death to America. And what I'm concerned about is that while they clearly have in mind bringing death to what they call the little Satan, namely Israel, they probably have that in mind for us as well, the great Satan. The nuclear capabilities that Iran has long aspired to could already have been realized. We don't know. But quite possibly they have acquired, perhaps by just buying one from North Korea, for whom nuclear and ballistic missiles and other weapons are just cash commodities. In fact, their most important export product. Or maybe they've, proceeded sufficiently far with their own internal efforts to obtain nuclear weapons that they will have them on hand already. But it's not very far off if it's not already an accomplished fact. And that poses a mortal threat because, believe it or not, this particular strain of Shiite Islam that governs that country, they've been called the Twelvers, because they believe that the 12th Imam, a man who was put down in a well centuries ago, will come out of that well and usher in the golden age, be the Islamic Messiah. But he comes out of that well under circumstances that sound an awful lot like the apocalypse. The lamentations, the wailing, the beseeching for help because of horrific devastation that's taken place, will unfortunately quite possibly prompt these mullahs who think they're going to bring back the 12th Imam on their watch to engage in horrific attacks against Israel, against us or others, once they have these weapons of mass destruction. They certainly have used terrorism against all of us in the past, and I think that there's every reason to believe that they will up their game once they have the capability to do so. So this is yet another, and I hate to be the bearer of so much bad news. And again, I pray that I'm wrong, that this is all going to come home to roost, these chickens, in our lifetimes. But I fear that's where we are at the moment, in part thanks to bad decisions that have been made by us and others previously.
It seems that the Biden plan is more like appeasement than anything else. We need 100%. We need more forward-leaning measures to prevent weapon development there in Iran. And so, when you look at all of this, when you look at China, and we talk about Russia and Iran, and then you really see the Biden administration and the way that they're responding. It's no wonder that people are really beginning to wake up and say, wait a minute, these are some serious things here. Thank you, Frank. Your depth is really remarkable. I do want to pivot. I know your time is so precious, and you've been so gracious. Thank you for spending such time with us. I do want to ask you.
Nothing more important than to visit with you. So take as much time as you need.
Thank you. I do want to talk just for a moment about what's happening right here in our own backyard. Because we know the unrest that has been created by groups like Antifa and leftist rioters. We saw some 200 cities in 2020 produced a Democrat policy of defunding, demeaning our law enforcement, our community, in effect, demoralizing and weakening our police deterrence across the country. And now we see these effects of these changes with record homicides, a rise in crime, people fearing for the security of their families and communities. It seems that every morning that I turn on the news, I'm hearing about someone else who's getting pushed in front of a subway or shot up at a synagogue or church. I want to ask you, as you see these things unraveling, as you see the sequence, why do you think that this has happened? And where did the impetus for defunding police and creating insecurity in America come from? Where is this coming from? Help us understand.
Well, again, these are excellent questions, but multifaceted.
Yes.
I would say that where we find ourselves is a function of the cumulative effects of having failed to address not only enemies foreign, but enemies domestic as well. In fact, I think going back to basically Joe McCarthy's era in the 1950s, it's almost been unacceptable in polite company to even acknowledge that we could have domestic enemies, let alone that they could possibly become so formidable that they could realize their stated objective. And I'm talking about Marxists on the one hand, but what I think of as Sharia supremacists or Islamists, jihadists on the other hand. And Rebecca, the particularly worrying thing that they are making common cause. They may have different outcomes in mind, but they are perfectly prepared to work together to achieve their immediate shared objective, which is the destruction of the United States of America as we know it. And
why would the Democratic Party not oppose this breakdown in rule of law? I mean, it affects all of us. It affects every American.
Because the Democratic Party now considers some of those forces, whether they're Marxists, whether they're Islamists, to be their base, and are increasingly aligned with their objectives and acting on their agenda. And again, this may sound incredible, except when you look back on what happened in the summer of 2020, when you look at what Joe Biden said, when you look at what Kamala Harris said, when you look at what Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and other prominent Democrats said about Antifa, about Black Lives Matter, about rioters in America's cities, the rule of law coming completely apart, the imperative of not prosecuting the perpetrators of even attacks on federal property like courthouses and the like. You see the depth to which a party that I once voted as a Democrat. I worked for a prominent United States Senate member of the Democratic Party, Scoop Jackson, back in the day. He's spinning at a very high RPM, I can tell you, in his grave at the moment over what has become of his party. But that's the simple, regrettable truth of the matter, is we're now dealing with a party that bears no relation to John Kennedy's government, or, I would argue Harry Truman's, or maybe even FDR's to some extent, though the penetration of our government by the communists began during FDR's time, for sure. But the point is that where we find ourselves at the moment is Marxists here are receiving support from Marxists in China, and I would argue Marxists in Russia and elsewhere. We're watching they make them, as I say, forge working relationships with these Islamists. Interestingly enough, I was talking earlier today with an expert on what's been going on in Texas with the jihadis of the Muslim Brotherhood dominating the Muslim communities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, for example, and their various front groups associated with the Muslim Brotherhood have been beavering away feverishly in recent months for the purpose of doing exactly what this jihadist who took the hostages in the synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, was seeking to do, namely to spring an Al-Qaeda operative who, by the way, has a background in and was caught seemingly planning biological and chemical weapons attacks against Americans in Afghanistan and perhaps elsewhere, when she was caught and interrogated. And at that point, she, by the way, tried to kill the Americans who were doing the interrogation. And only because she didn't connect with the targets when she fired 2 shots, she was nonetheless trying to kill Americans. So these are the people that are part of our problem domestically, whether it's the Council on American Islamic Relations, whether it's the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, whether it's the International Islamic Institute. There's a T in there somewhere. Islamic Thought, I think it is. These are groups that have been working towards the Muslim Brotherhood agenda. Freeing this woman, Aifia, I think it is, Siddiqui, is an example of the kind of radical anti-American sentiment that they express. What you're seeing from Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others in the Congress, some of whom are Muslim, some of whom are not, to sort of embrace this agenda, is part of a domestic enemy problem that we simply have not ever seen before in our history. I would go back to the Civil War, at least. Yeah. And we're confronting it at the same time that we've got these very serious problems internationally. It's a real witch's brew, a world of hurt, I'm fond of saying.
Wow, Frank Gaffney, thank you so much. This is all just so very important. We did not have time to get into so much about the issues, national security threat that we see at the open border in the Southwest. But we know that there lies another major issue with hundreds of thousands being unchecked and allowed into the U.S.
Millions.
We know that illegal drugs are pouring over. We know that terrorists are coming through. Everyone in the world knows that the border is wide open. And we can't explain why the Biden administration is so intent on keeping our borders wide open, except that they're hoping that they'll increase their voter base, perhaps. But we saw over 100,000 deaths from drug overdoses in 2021. So AMAC is keeping an eye on those things. But all of this is so important. And really for us to understand that the Biden administration is responsible for this wide open border, reckless decision, shutting down of the XL pipeline, killing U.S. energy independence, reckless federal spending, inflation, All of this could be considered threats to our internal security. And Frank, we're going to keep our eyes on things. This has been a real eye opener, I think, for those listening, and even for myself, to understand the gravity of it all, the importance of it all. It is so important that we understand what's at risk. And so last final question before I let you run, as we march forward in 2022 and we see the American people are beginning to get better informed and really angered at what the Biden administration is doing or not doing, what might you predict? Do you think that the November 2022 elections will see a major turnaround? Is there some silver lining here? And is America waking up to these threats abroad and domestically?
Well, let me just say thank you for further fleshing out the proposition I put to you a moment ago, which is that what the Biden administration is doing is a wrecking operation across the broadest imaginable front. And to your point about those open borders translating into a changed electorate, look no further than what the mayor of New York City has just agreed to, which is to allow up to 800,000 people who weren't in New York 30 days ago to vote on local issues, of course, but there won't be any break on trying to get them to not vote in federal elections, you can be sure. So all of this is going on, and I think the American people are awakening to it, Rebecca. That's the good news, and I really want to thank you and this really important service you're providing and the organization that you run for, among other things, helping equip people to understand why we can't do other than be outraged by what's happening and work assiduously and with the largest possible coalition to make a change in 2022. And when you look at the laundry list of things that are in these two pieces of legislation that are now awaiting Senate action, they're the laundry list of fraud-inducing or enabling techniques that if you want to steal an election, if you want to ensure that the outrage of the American people about the direction of our country at the moment cannot be corrected, this is the way you would do it. So I'm, again, prayerful that at the moment, it looks as though the votes are not there.
It looks as if they're not there.
Elections, they look as though they're not there.
That's
to
right.
change the filibuster or to adopt these two pieces of legislation that would make permanent, I think, the Democratic Party's majorities and prevent free and fair elections in the future. I'm praying to God that that's the case. And if it is, it will be because people like your membership are engaged, I know. But if that's the case, then I do think there's a good chance that there will be an epic course correction for our country. Now, it won't mean that we don't have a problem in the White House, but we may be lucky enough to have a change in leadership and the majorities in both the House and the Senate. But a big thing that will determine whether that's a real change or whether it's just a sort of cosmetic one is the quality of the people that are elected. And I think there are an awful lot of exciting candidates, but we really don't want to have people who are more or less okay with the Democrats' agenda, just they don't want to do it quite as fast or quite as costly or expensively. And that won't serve in the moment we're in now. And as I say, in the meantime, we may have a very, very rough patch if one or more of these things internationally takes place, or the people domestically decide they're going to act out as they did in the summer of 2020.
Frank, thank you so much. This is all really important. And before I let you go, I do want to turn to Latin America. Now, the last 2 years have seen authoritative regimes that regain control. They regain lost ground in Bolivia, Argentina, Honduras, and elsewhere. And the question I have for you, Frank, is how can the United States challenge this rising authoritarianism in our neighborhood, right in our backyard, really? And what implications does this have to U.S. national security? Essentially, how is democracy being dismantled in Latin America? Talk to us about Latin America. We talked about China, Russia, we talked about Iran. But folks have got to know what's going on right in our backyard.
Well, people call it our backyard. I kind of think of it as our front yard, Rebecca, simply because what happens in Latin America has such a profound impact on us. You mentioned a moment ago, the border. Where are those people coming from? Now, some of them are coming from elsewhere around the world, of course, but they're coming through Latin America to get to our country. Many of them are simply people who reside in Latin America, but who don't want to live under the sorts of, you mentioned authoritarian governments. In some cases, they're full-on communists and totalitarian governments. And sadly, we've just seen in the past few months in Peru, a very important strategically located nation, and in neighboring Chile, communists elected to run their governments, which will only greatly intensify the problems on a number of different levels. You mentioned drug trafficking. There will be more drugs being trafficked. We've talked a little bit about the penetration by the Chinese communists. Their Belt and Road Initiative is massively inside the wire, if you will, in our hemisphere. In Peru, in Chile, and elsewhere, you're going to see, I think, lots of infrastructure built out. In fact, in Peru, there's not one, but two megaports, one now under construction, one in the planning stages, that will be useful not only to the Chinese communists for ensuring that their products are more available here in this hemisphere, that the countries of this hemisphere are more dependent upon their products, those supply chains we alluded to earlier, but also they can host carrier strike groups through which the Chinese will be able to project power unlike anything we've seen in our hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So those things are happening. And then thirdly, the worse things get in the hemisphere, and they will inevitably as the communists do what they do, which is destroy economies and destroy personal freedoms. And with the help of the Chinese, they become more and more oppressive and domineering. You're going to see people voting with their feet. And so the border crisis that we have now will only intensify, perhaps, to the tune of many millions more coming here, for whom there are no jobs, and life will become much more difficult for the rest of us, especially if under the Biden formula, they're entitled to a full panoply of social welfare, education, healthcare, and other benefits. So it brings us back to your most important question, and that is, what do we do about this? And the first thing, it seems to me, is we have to understand that we can't continue to ignore it. Only then can you begin taking corrective actions. This year, we're going to see the last two major nations in the hemisphere up for grabs: Colombia and Brazil. The communists are going to make a concerted effort to take over both of those countries as well. And as things stand right now, they have a decent shot at doing so. Now, partly that's honestly because I don't think the Biden administration is opposed to that. I think that they're actually, the Marxists, at least inside this administration, are quite content to see the Marxist takeover of Latin America. But the rest of us who don't want this hemisphere to be essentially a no-go zone for the United States, seeing greatly diminished not only our influence and presence in the region, but our commercial relationships as well, and the rising presence and power of our most mortal enemies in our back or front yard. I mean, these things require us to become engaged, starting with Colombia and Brazil, helping freedom-loving people there avoid what's happened just now in Peru and Chile, and in so many of the other countries, as you mentioned earlier. We have a chance to turn this around, but it is a fleeting chance, and it requires our attention and our engagement And it requires it in a scale and in a way that we're not going to see, I'm afraid, from the Biden team.
Well, Frank, thank you so much. This has been really very insightful, and your expertise is so valuable to our members and really in helping all Americans understand really what the stakes are, the threats, and the impact. So thank you. We live in such interesting times, don't we? But with people like you helping to guide the public understanding and really speaking the truth, I think that we were so well served today. And I do believe that Ronald Reagan, for whom you worked, had it right. And the future belongs to the courageous, not to the timid, not to the dependent. So let's hope that in 2022, we have a great year. Frank, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Pleasure's mine, Rebecca. Thank you for having me, and thank you for taking it all over the world, really, as we need to.
Oh, wonderful! This was
and I hope
so
leaving
important.
your folks with a sense of hope that we can do something about it if we start attending to these matters with the urgency that they require. So thank you.
Excellent. And I want to thank all those out there listening and to our AMAC members. Thank you for tuning in today. And thank you for helping to send hundreds of thousands of emails to our members of Congress and those in the Senate and the House, state legislatures, warning them that this voting bill is not what the American people want. It just invites more fraud. And so AMAC is working very hard on that front. To learn more about how you can get involved, go to amacaction.org, amacaction.org, or amac.us. You'll find a ton of resources on both of those sites. And if you haven't downloaded the AMAC News app, you can watch, you can listen to this show and track breaking news right there on your smartphone. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button, follow, like, and share wherever you are on social media. Until next time, folks, I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your podcast, Better for America. Thank you for being here. God bless you and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Better for America podcast. To learn more about AMAC and all it has to offer, visit us at www.amac.us.